Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video, where, having just completed the spectacular Field of the Cloth of Gold, Henry VIII was making his way back to bonny old England. But first, he was going to stop off just outside of the port of Calais to a place called Gravelines, where he was to meet with the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Charles V. This was the pair's second meeting, having already met in the late May of 1520 in the city of Canterbury. This second meeting, as well as a later state visit in mid-1522 by Charles V to the south coast of England, was to have major ramifications on European politics and indeed the Italian wars that were to be taking place between 1521 and 1526. For the next week, up until the 1st of July 1520, the two kings entertained each other, as had been done at the Field of the Cloth of Gold for Francis I. But this was a far cheaper and a far smaller event that had occurred with the imperial leader. To sum up what was negotiated at this week-long event was the agreement that both Henry and Charles were to keep intact and not break any treaties that had been signed in months and years prior to June 1520. So the existing Treaty of London that had been signed by the major European powers, signed as an alliance against the Ottoman Empire, the impending threat from the Middle East, was to remain intact. But what was also agreed was that no new treaty was to be signed with the French king, Francis I. So whilst it may look like the European powers were going to live in harmony as such, it was more a case that Henry was sliding closer towards the imperial leader of Charles V. There are probably numerous reasons why Henry VIII decided to get a little bit closer to his imperial counterpart of Charles V. For one, his queen, Catherine of Aragon, was technically a Spaniard, and so Charles V, being the King of Spain as well, was an easy and likely alliance to have. For two, a wrestling match that had occurred at the Field of the Cloth of Gold between Henry VIII and Francis I had left the English king's ego rather bruised, as he lost this particular match, despite challenging the French king and probably thinking himself a better sportsman than the French. Thirdly, there was no lands that would be encroached upon or potentially threatened by that of the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and the other lands that consisted under Charles V's dominion. And lastly, the fourth point is that Henry VIII probably had a slight monopoly on European politics at this time. As I mentioned in my video about the meeting in Canterbury, Charles V was keen to stress that he was the leader of a growing European superpower, but was slightly nervous that if Henry was to side with the French and the French king, Francis I, then they could make things very difficult for Charles V and his wider European supremacy. The meeting concluded, the two kings parted ways and returned to their home nations. And over the next year to a year and a half, Charles V declared war on his French counterpart, Francis I. As part of these Italian wars, the alliance between England and the Holy Roman Empire grew ever closer, with the signing of the Treaty of Bruges by diplomatic envoys representing Henry VIII and Charles V, them being Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the sort of power behind the English throne, or so some say, and the Duchess of Savoy, Margaret of Austria. What was agreed at the Treaty of Bruges was that Henry VIII's daughter, Princess Mary, was to be married off to the Holy Roman Emperor when she came of age, which was some time yet, considering that Princess Mary was only 5 years old at the time of 1521. Also agreed was that Henry would declare war on the French by 1523 and assist Charles V waging his wars in the northern Italian regions. This treaty was ratified by a state visit made by Charles V to the South English coast, where he arrived at the port of Dover on the 26th of May. The first stop on this state visit by Charles V was a visit back to the city of Canterbury that he had previously been at 2 years before. He and the King of England, Henry VIII, arrived at the city on the 28th of May, 1522, pretty much exactly 2 years since Charles was last in Canterbury. Although on this occasion it wasn't quite as large or extravagant event as had previously been seen 2 years before, because there was a lot to see and a lot to say and do on this larger state visit. Henry and Charles then made their way from Canterbury and processed towards the city of London, but not before visiting Sittingbourne on the 31st of May and the city of Rochester by the 1st of June. But by the 2nd of June, Henry VIII and Charles V arrived at the Palace of Placentia, the main residence that Henry VIII was using at this time of Tudor history. Henry VIII would host Charles V at his Palace of Placentia for about 4 days, before moving off to one of his other residences in London known as Bridewell Palace. Another 3 days of hosting for Charles V at Bridewell Palace before making another stop to Richmond Palace in the west of London, but just for a singular day on the 9th of June, before another singular day visitation to Hampton Court, the residence of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Now today most people associate Hampton Court as the palace that was the residence of Henry VIII and subsequent kings therewith. But it was only after 1529 and the fall of Thomas Wolsey that this palace became part of the royal residences, plural. So Cardinal Thomas Wolsey hosted these two kingly counterparts on the 10th of June 1522. But then we come to the main event that was this state visit. On the 11th of June 1522, Henry VIII took Charles V to Windsor Castle, the oldest or one of the oldest castles sitting within the English landscape, having been built in the year 1067-68 roughly. They would stay there for roughly 10 days, where a new treaty, a Treaty of Windsor, was signed on the 16th of June 1522, of course. This Treaty of Windsor was pretty much an exact duplicate of the Treaty of Bruges that had been signed by the royal envoys in 1521, the year before. And as a gift, a gesture of goodwill towards the ever closer relations between England and the Holy Roman Empire, was a piece, or a few pieces at least, of the famous Montezuma's gold that had been picked up by the Spaniard Hernando Cortes. The Treaty of Windsor signed and the Windsor Castle visit completed, the two kingly counterparts then made their way towards the conclusion of this state visit, but not before heading towards the city of Winchester, a powerhouse city in itself, dating well back before the Tudor period and well before the Norman conquest of 1066. It was a powerhouse, a financial and religiously significant city as well. But during the Tudor period, there was a famous round table that was emulating King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which the Tudors thought themselves a bit like. And within this round table, there is a Tudor Rose, a combination of two warring factions that had been at war with each other in the late 15th century, the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. After a few days, it was time for Charles to be led towards the port city of Southampton. Henry VIII bid his imperial counterpart adieu, and Charles set sail for the Spanish city of Santander, which he arrived at on the 6th of July, 1522. A successful state visit, and relations between these two powers very much strong. So what were the immediate repercussions to this state visit and the alliance between England and the Holy Roman Empire? Well, in the short term, quite a lot. The two powers came together and England declared war on France, as had been agreed in the Treaty of Bruges and later the Treaty of Windsor. But when Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, was sent over to France to skirmish with the French forces and basically distract them from the wider Italian conflict in places like Milan, Genoa and Turin, well, late 1523, Charles Brandon goes over to France, skirmishes with the French, and then is back home in England by Christmas, leaving Charles V, the Holy Roman Empire, to pretty much do most of the legwork in terms of fighting the French forces. This all came to a head on the 24th of February 1525, where the Battle of Pavia took place. The French forces, commanded by the king himself, Francis I, had been besieging the city of Pavia for about 4 months previous. The forces of Charles V decided to try and rout the French king and encircle him within a tight space. The French were completely annihilated, and the French king himself, Francis I, was captured by Charles V and imprisoned in Spain for over a year before signing the Treaty of Rome, in which he agreed never to try and claim on the Italian states ever again. So by the time we get to the Battle of Pavia, and indeed the signing of the Treaty of Rome a year later, Charles V sort of realises that actually the great military alliance with England was pretty useless and he didn't really need them. Then came Henry VIII's great matter, which was to drive a wedge between England and pretty much the rest of Europe at this time. This is basically the case of Henry VIII, King of England, wanting to A, annul his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, B, create a new male heir to the English throne, which had so far failed with his marriage to Catherine, and C, remarry the new courtly favourite, Anne Boleyn. Now, if you know your Tudor history, you'll realise that the eventuality is that Henry breaks from Rome, sets up his Church of England, and dissolves the monasteries associated with the Pope, the Vatican, and the Catholic Church. But in terms of his relationship with Charles V, well, that was to sour very quickly over the next few years of the late 1520s, early 1530s. Charles V was already, since the start of his reign as Holy Roman Emperor, been fighting against those that drifted towards Martin Luther and his new style of the Christian faith, another break away from the Catholic Church. So to know that a regional ally, a king of England, was turning towards the Protestant faith, albeit slightly different compared to Luther, well, this was very disappointing indeed. Then Charles V became equally disappointed and then frustrated that Henry VIII would choose to annul his marriage. Not just that, but to a fellow Spaniard, of which Charles was the King of Spain. Charles V pleaded with Henry VIII to reconsider his annulment and indeed his breakaway from the Catholic Church under the Pope. But Henry VIII was a decisive man and very stubborn to change the mind of. So it is not surprising that since this great state visit that Charles V made to the English nation all the way back in mid-1522, that he never met Henry VIII in person ever again. Their only contact was through envoys, embassies, and correspondence. So all in all, although greatly and immediately successful for both sides of this treaty, England and the Holy Roman Empire, in the long term, things started to fail and crumble to the point of no alliance at all. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that you have learned something about a part of history that doesn't get discussed all that often. I shall wish you a good day, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.